He started getting a lot of ear infections and sinus infections and sore throats. So when he was 2.5, we had his tonsils out, and the x-rays picked up an abnormality in the bone.
At first glance, it sounds like a story you've heard 100 times before. A boy with a severe facial condition, a rebellious biker mother, a heartbreaking Hollywood movie that left audiences in tears.
Don't worry, Mr. Sims. I look weird, but otherwise I'm real normal. Everything will be cool. Thanks a lot.
But what if the film that inspired millions only showed part of what really happened? What if, before her death, Rocky Dennis's mother sat down and shared details about her son, her own life, and the movie that most people never knew?
Rocky was here to do something, and now that the movie's come out and I'm going through all these interviews and things, I see exactly why Rocky was here and exactly why he beat the doctors for so many years.
Today, we're taking a closer look at Roy Lee Rocky Dennis, his mother Rusty, and the truth she shared about the story that became a legend. But before we get to her revelations, we need to understand what this family actually lived through.
And the x-rays picked up an abnormality in the bone. So they took x-rays of his entire body, and they found that there was something wrong. They weren't sure what.
Roy Dennis, known as Rocky because he wouldn't sleep as a baby unless someone rocked him, was born on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California. His parents were Florence "Rusty" Tullis and her second husband, Roy Dennis. During his early years, Rocky dealt with frequent ear infections and sinus problems. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the usual childhood illnesses. Then, around the age of 2, he underwent a routine tonsillectomy, and everything changed. During the process, an X-ray technician noticed an unusual issue with his skull. That discovery led to months of testing and regular trips to UCLA Medical Center. After nearly a year of examinations, doctors finally had an answer: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. The diagnosis changed the course of Rocky's life. The disease was so rare that, in 1965, doctors told Rusty only 6 cases had ever been documented anywhere in the world. Just 6. The condition caused excessive calcium to build up in the skull, making the bones thicker and larger over time. As the skull expanded, it altered facial features and gradually affected the brain, eyesight, hearing, and other neurological functions. Doctors gave Rusty a devastating prediction. They told her Rocky would eventually lose his sight, would probably suffer intellectual impairment, and would likely die before reaching the age of 7. 7 years old. Most parents would have been crushed by that news. Rusty wasn't. Instead of accepting that outcome, she challenged it. She refused to believe that doctors had already written her son's future. The way she raised Rocky, and the things she later said about that journey, are at the heart of this story. This was where Rusty's determination became impossible to ignore. She refused to allow schools, doctors, or anyone else to decide what Rocky could or couldn't do. While the family lived in Covina and Glendora, she fought to keep him in regular classrooms and pushed for him to be treated like every other child. When doctors argued that his vision problems would make reading difficult, she disagreed. When schools tried to remove him from mainstream education, she challenged those decisions. Years later, Rusty said she believed the resistance had little to do with Rocky's abilities. In her view, the real issue was that other parents felt uncomfortable. Rocky eventually proved her point. During a visit to UCLA's Center for Genetic Research, screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan met him and was immediately struck by his warmth, humor, and personality. Phelan later remarked that Rusty wasn't a typical mother, but she was exactly the parent Rocky needed. But before we get to the things Rusty later revealed, it's worth asking an important question. Who was this woman, really? Because the version portrayed by Cher in the movie was only part of the picture. The real Rusty was far more complicated. Let's take a closer look at Florence, Rusty Tullis, born Florence Steinberg. The woman behind the leather jacket had a life story that was every bit as unusual as the one Hollywood put on screen. Rusty was born in Brooklyn, New York, on May 29, 1936. Her father worked as a truck driver. She grew up in a Jewish family and developed a reputation for speaking her mind from a young age. At 13, she was expelled from junior high because of truancy. By 14, she was using cannabis and spending time with motorcycle gangs. At 15, she left school altogether and worked as a hoochie-coochie dancer at Coney Island. She wasn't even old enough to legally drive. At 17, she married truck driver Tommy Mason. Within a couple of years, they had a son named Joshua. The marriage eventually ended, and Rusty moved back in with her parents. Later, she married Roy Dennis and relocated to California. In 1961, Rocky was born. By the time Rocky received his diagnosis, Rusty had already developed a personal belief that guided much of her life. She believed that if people could make themselves sick, they could also help make themselves well through the power of their mindset. She carried that belief into Rocky's upbringing. Whenever he suffered headaches or periods of pain, she would send him to his room and tell him to focus on getting better. Rocky's outlook on life suggests that approach may have strengthened his spirit. At the same time, it was a philosophy that came with its own complications. The movie touched on another part of Rusty's life, but it softened many of the details. Rusty was an active member of the Turks motorcycle gang. These weren't hobbyists playing dress-up on weekends. They were tough, loyal people who formed a close-knit community. Rocky became a beloved member of that world. The character Gar, played by Sam Elliott in the film, was inspired by a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's longtime partner. The bikers who surrounded Rocky weren't simply colorful background characters added for dramatic effect. They were part of his extended family. Rusty was also unusually direct when discussing her substance use. In later interviews, she pushed back against how the movie portrayed that part of her life. The film suggested she turned to substances because she was struggling under the weight of Rocky's condition. Rusty rejected that interpretation. According to her, partying and substance use had been part of her lifestyle long before. She said she partied frequently and didn't view it as a response to hardship. To her, it was simply part of the life she chose to live. That distinction mattered a great deal to her because she felt the movie misunderstood her motivations. So what happens when a woman like Rusty, a biker, a school dropout, a substance user, and a fiercely protective mother, is asked to look back on everything after her son's death? Because what she later said about Rocky, about the movie, and about the final chapter of his life is where the story begins to look very different from the version most people think they know. The film, the prophets, and what Rusty really thought. By 1985, Mask was playing in theaters across the United States. The movie was directed by Peter Bogdanovich and starred Cher as Rusty and Eric Stoltz as Rocky. It earned more than $48,236,000 at the box office. Rusty Dennis, meanwhile, received $15,000 for the rights to the story. Take a second to think about that. The film brought in over $48 million. The woman whose life, and whose son's life, made the entire story possible received $15,000. Yet that figure becomes even more complicated when you look closer. According to the Mask Wikipedia page and several interviews, most of that money went toward medical expenses for her older son, Joshua, who was receiving treatment for AIDS at the time. Rusty didn't sell Rocky's story to get rich. She sold it because she was trying to help save another son's life. When the movie was released, journalists rushed to interview Rusty. Many expected her to express gratitude toward Hollywood, perhaps become emotional, and praise the film without hesitation. Instead, she gave a response few expected. She described the movie as a fairy tale, not a tribute, not a perfect memorial, a fairy tale. Those were her exact words. In a 1986 interview with the Chicago Tribune, Rusty explained, "I always thought showing Rocky's courage would help a lot of disabled kids and the parents of disabled kids. Sometimes they are more disabled than their kids. I didn't realize the movie would be about me, too. Thanks to Cher's brilliance, I come off a kind of heroine." That quote says a lot. Rusty wasn't criticizing Cher. In fact, she openly praised her performance. What seemed harder for her to accept was how much attention shifted away from Rocky. She had pictured a film focused mainly on her son's courage and determination. Instead, the story gave significant attention to her as well, turning her into one of the movie's main figures, a complex and colorful character, when she had always viewed herself simply as Rocky's mother. When speaking about Cher, Rusty remained complimentary. In that same Chicago Tribune interview, she said, "Cher depicted the way I am very well. I always thought I was perfectly normal, that the rest of the world is nuts." That remark, "the rest of the world is nuts," may be one of the clearest descriptions of Rusty's personality ever recorded. The Chicago Tribune article also confirmed the two biggest differences between the film and real life that Rusty discussed. The first was the timeline. The movie squeezed more than 10 years of events into what appeared to be roughly a single year. The second difference seemed to bother her even more. Her older son Joshua was completely absent from the story. He was removed from the film version of Rocky's life. Then there was the issue of the soundtrack. Rocky Dennis was a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen. His love for Springsteen's music was well known. Peter Bogdanovich originally built the movie's soundtrack around Springsteen songs. However, Universal Pictures was unable to secure an agreement with Springsteen's label, Columbia Records. Without informing Bogdanovich, the studio replaced the planned music with songs by Bob Seger. Rusty wasn't happy about it. During a 1985 appearance on the San Francisco talk show People Are Talking, she made her feelings clear with a single sentence. "I don't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was." It was a short comment, but it said everything. Bogdanovich was furious over the decision. He filed a $19 million lawsuit against Universal, arguing that the change violated his contractual right to final cut approval. The Springsteen songs would not return until the 2004 Director's Cut DVD release, nearly 20 years after Rocky's story first appeared on the big screen. But there is one part of this story that receives far less attention. The arguments about money, music, and movie accuracy are complicated topics. What Rusty said about Rocky's final night carries a different kind of weight altogether. Rocky's final evening and what really happened. By September 1978, Rocky's condition had worsened considerably. He was 16 years old, and the disease doctors believed would take his life before age 7 was finally catching up to him. During his last weeks, he relied on a wheelchair. The headaches that had followed him throughout his life became far more severe, reaching a point where little seemed to help. On October 3, 1978, Rocky, Rusty, and the bikers, who had become part of their extended family, went out for dinner together. Everyone could see how much weaker he had become. Later that night, Rocky returned home suffering from another headache. Rusty responded the same way she always had throughout his childhood. She told him to go to his room and make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died in his sleep at home on the morning of October 4, 1978. He was 16 years old and only months away from turning 17. He had survived nearly 10 years longer than doctors originally predicted. The movie presents a different version of those events. In the film, Rusty discovers Rocky's body herself in one of its most emotional scenes. In reality, she was not home when he died. At the time, Rusty was at her attorney's office dealing with a substance possession charge. Her partner Bernie, the real person who inspired the character Gar, called and informed her what had happened. That difference matters, not because it paints Rusty in a negative light, but because it shows how Hollywood softened parts of a story that was already difficult enough. There is also the question of Rusty's approach to raising Rocky. Throughout his life, she encouraged him to treat illness differently than most people would. Her make-yourself-well philosophy shaped the way she cared for him from childhood onward. It's important not to place words in her mouth. Rusty never publicly described that approach as a mistake. She never spoke about it as a source of regret. Those conclusions belong to other people, not to her. What she consistently said was much simpler. She believed in it completely. Did that philosophy sometimes lead to Rocky's suffering being overlooked or minimized? Only Rocky and Rusty could truly answer that question. What history does show is that she never backed away from her beliefs. She never apologized for them. Right up until the end, she maintained that her approach had given Rocky something priceless: the ability to refuse to think of himself as a boy who was dying. But to really understand Rusty Dennis, you have to understand Joshua. Because the brother who was removed from the movie may be the single most important piece of the story. He helps explain nearly everything that followed, including the reason Rusty agreed to sell Rocky's story in the first place. Joshua was the son Hollywood chose to leave out. Rusty Dennis's first son, Joshua Mason, was completely absent from Mask, and reports suggest that decision upset her. By 1985, Joshua was working as a writer in San Francisco. The following year, doctors diagnosed him with Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer strongly linked to AIDS during the height of the epidemic in the 1980s. Joshua was openly gay. He said his mother supported him, although she had hoped he would one day have children, and even suggested using a sperm bank. In 1987, Joshua died at the age of 32. Rusty had now lost both of her sons. According to records connected to Mask, much of the money Rusty received from the film rights went toward Joshua's medical treatment. She had sold the story of one son while trying desperately to save the other. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, she once said, "Joshua doesn't believe in dying, and neither do I." By the time Rusty herself approached the end of her life, the question became, what legacy did she leave behind? What did this stubborn, complicated, larger-than-life woman think when her own time was running short? The final years of Rusty Dennis. After Rocky's death, Rusty relocated to San Francisco and embraced Buddhism. She began working as a counselor, helping people dealing with substance-related struggles. Around the time Mask was released, she also planned to work with the Shanti Project, an organization that supported terminally ill people, including AIDS patients. The woman who had spent much of her life surrounded by turmoil was gradually building a calmer existence. One thing, however, never changed. She still loved motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Rusty, who was then using the name Florence Tullis, was riding her three-wheeled motorcycle when disaster struck. One of the right side tires came off, causing her to lose control. The vehicle hit a curb, and she was thrown into a telephone pole. What happened afterward was almost unbelievable. For a time, no one close to her even knew she had been injured. Friends and relatives only learned about the accident after seeing a short newspaper item in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune about an unidentified 70-year-old woman hurt in a motorcycle crash. They pieced together the clues and realized it was Rusty. She suffered severe injuries, including 2 broken legs and a punctured lung. She survived the crash itself, something that seemed fitting for someone as tough as Rusty Dennis. But the infection that followed was another battle entirely. It was one she could not win. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. Even near the end, she remained the same person she had always been. She spoke about Rocky's death as though it were simply another journey, and Rocky had always enjoyed going places. She also repeated what she had said about Joshua. Neither of them believed in death. Through every tragedy she faced, she never asked, "Why me?" She didn't ask it after losing Rocky. She didn't ask it after losing Joshua. And she didn't ask it for herself. A 1986 profile in the Chicago Tribune painted an unforgettable picture of her. It described her as a 49-year-old Jewish mother who had overcome substance use, worked as a go-go dancer, sold Shackley products, and lived in a biker crash pad in San Francisco's Mission District that was spotless enough for a Good Housekeeping magazine photo shoot. She shared the place with a nephew and 3 bikers known as Pelican, Lenny, and Steve. The description sounds almost impossible, yet somehow it captured exactly who she was. So after looking at everything, the facts, the contradictions, the differences between the movie and reality, what should we take away from this story? The legacy and what it all means. When the Hollywood version is stripped away, the real story becomes even more powerful. Rocky Dennis lived for nearly 17 years with a condition that many believed would take his life long before that. Yet he refused to let his appearance define him. He approached life with humor, kindness, and determination. Despite starting school academically behind his classmates, he graduated from Sandburg Junior High as an honor student. He was voted best buddy, most good-natured, and friendliest camper. He tutored fellow students for $3 an hour and negotiated his own rate. He knew the night sky by memory. At summer camp, he fell in love with a blind girl. She couldn't see his face, but she saw everything else about him. When doctors offered surgery that could change his appearance, Rocky asked a question that stayed with people for years. Who will I see in the mirror if I change my face? In the end, he chose to remain exactly as he was. His mother was just as unusual. She was a biker from Brooklyn with a history of substance use, school truancy, and a firm belief that society was more damaged than her son ever was. In many ways, she proved correct. She challenged school officials who wanted to place Rocky in special education. She argued with doctors who tried to limit his future with predictions and deadlines. She built a family around him, made up of rough-edged but loyal. Around the time Mask was released, she also planned to work with the Shanti Project, an organization that supported terminally ill people, including AIDS patients. The woman who had spent much of her life surrounded by turmoil was gradually building a calmer existence. One thing, however, never changed. She still loved motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Rusty, who was then using the name Florence Tullis, was riding her 3-wheeled motorcycle when disaster struck. One of the right side tires came off. Whether that sounds like praise, criticism, or a little of both is up to the viewer. The facts remain unchanged. Rocky Dennis died peacefully in his own bed, in his own home, without hospital machines, and without losing his dignity. His mother had promised him that would happen. She kept her word. Rusty Dennis died in November 2006 at the age of 70. In many ways, she left the world exactly as she had lived in it, moving forward on her own terms and refusing to slow down. If you're looking for a neat ending with every loose end tied up, Rusty Dennis's story isn't that kind of story. Instead, it leaves something more honest. It leaves a life filled with contradictions, mistakes, courage, heartbreak, and determination. It leaves the truth, with all of its complications, still intact. And now you know the full story. Did any of this surprise you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind Hollywood's biggest legends and myths, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We have many more stories like this coming your way every week.